All right, Scott, repeat yourself. I heard it.
From the top. I'm Scott Dorey, co-host of RMU. We're broadcasting live from historic Philadelphia. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to semester 11 of RMU, a place for those who decide what stays and what goes. For the spring 2020 semester, we'll talk about records at scale, the dreaded big data. Please don't forget to invite your friends and colleagues. The more the merrier. To those wishing to receive credits for RMU, you'll be able to request them at the end of the semester, but you must attend all 5 classes to receive credit. And being that this is the last class, we do have the previous 4 classes on demand. Recordings for today's class and the last 3 semesters are all available at community.fife.com. Records Management University is a credit qualifying course with ICRM and AIM. Each class is worth 1 continuing education credit. We'll send you more information about the credits in the upcoming weeks, so stay tuned for that. And as always, this class is sponsored by Fife Systems, enterprise software for securely managing records, content, and processes. That's FEITH.com. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to the highly esteemed Dean of RMU, Mitch Farbstein.
Well, thank you, Scott. Just to double check, if anybody's out there in listening land, could you just chat Scott and let him know that you're hearing stuff? We had a little glitch about 5 minutes ago. So do that, please. I will continue, though. And as the last class of the semester, it's always an emotional one. Everybody, last day of class, and you're going to go for spring break or you're going, well, no spring break, you're going to go for the summer. We're broadcasting this basically live in our studio since we're an organization that supports a lot of different agencies in the computer industry, and as such, we are, what do they call it? Not a required organization, but
Essential.
essential. So we've been here, and we were able to put together the last class, and I hope you enjoy it. It's a little bit different in some ways, consistent though in others. And so we're going to get through this, and then, as Scott mentioned, the recordings will be available to you. Your ability to sign up for the credits will be available to you as well. And we're always happy to have your feedback. And so, with no further ado on my side, we're going to dig into it. Okay, last class of the last semester of the 11th semester, beating the odds. So in the past, we've talked about beating the odds and what that meant. In this particular class, I'm going to delve into something called not beating the odds. And you'll see this as we go through. This is a difficult subject in terms of records management. It's probably the most complex of any type of record that you're going to maintain, because people are really not sure what a transactional record should be, what it should look like, how you would capture it, how you would save it, how you would get rid of it. So you may not, in your organization, even be considering, not playing the lottery, but not considering, saving transactional records, because they are very challenging. So we believe now that, if you can accomplish this, you are at the top of your game. And we'd like to have any input that you can offer to us through the community, through email, whatever, if you are actually doing the kinds of things I'm talking about. And so I really did save this as the last class, because you needed to understand the foundation of other things to see why this is so much different. Okay, so beating the odds. If you're going to play the lottery, here's a formula. If you win, I get 10%. That's the rule. Okay, so we've talked about our first 4 beating the odds all-star lineup: Helen Keller, Frederick Douglass, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela. And today on legacy data transactions, formatting and public access, we're going to be talking about Anne Frank. So odds beater, question mark is there, and you'll understand why at the end. So Anne Frank was born in 1929 and died in 1945, and I'll tell a little bit about the history. 6 million to one. If you understand that reference, it relates to basically she couldn't beat the odds.
Yeah.
So she went into hiding on July 6, 1942 in Holland and started her diary. Obviously, she went into hiding during World War II because she was Jewish. She was captured August 4th, 1944. So she was in quarantine, to bring it into terms of today, of 759 days with 8 people in her family and the related people that were staying with them in a space of about 800 square feet. So 1 or 2 weeks in quarantine, try 108 weeks. She died at Bergen-Belsen death camp in Poland. After surviving Auschwitz as a lone family member, Anne's father, Otto, was given the diary by the family that hid them. Her diary was first published on June 25th, 1947. It's basically the secret hideout. And her diary has sold more than 30 million copies in 70 languages. So her impact is different than all the other all-stars that we have talked about, because the other all-stars that we talked about were really, saw the fruits of their labor to a great extent,
Right.
how they changed society. Unfortunately, Anne never was able to do that. And it was kind of interesting. I think it was last Saturday, I was out shopping for something at a drugstore and I got all my stuff and I'm ready to leave. And lo and behold, this was on the counter as a recent publication. So this is basically the diary after 70 years. And I thought, what a coincidence that is.
Yeah.
This was not planned. And all of a sudden, this appears. It's like, whoa, she's still very, very relevant. And talking about Life magazine on a much lighter subject. Okay, so this was Life magazine back in November of 1971. And the only reason I bring this up, okay, not to just lighten things up, is I am written up in this.
I was going to say, you have this in your office.
I was written up in this magazine, and it wasn't about chemistry of madness, which some of you might think I am, but I'll just tell you real quickly, this was an article about me getting written up for the Heisman Trophy. And if you know football and where the Heisman Trophy appears, that's it. So I had to throw that in. I've waited years to figure out how do I weave this in to Records Management University. So I did.
You won the Heisman?
No, of course. If I won the Heisman, I wouldn't be here. It would have made too much money. No, it did. You'd have to read the article to understand it. But it was basically on any given Sunday, somebody's deserving of the Heisman Trophy. So the editor-in-chief of the Washington Bureau was at one of my games, and he wrote it up.
We've waited this long to weave it in.
Yeah.
You got to give us a lowdown. What position did you play and where at?
I was a running back at Bucknell University.
Beautiful.
So, yeah. And I'm paying for it every day because I can hardly walk.
You sure can present, though.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you. All right, let's get into the meat of this. You're probably bored with this already. Transactional data, like I said, it's a little bit different than things that we've talked about, and I'm going to tell you why. The real challenge with transactional data is digging it up, finding it. Where is it? Because as I get to my next slide, transactions as data records in organizations, there's so many systems that you have out there, depending on what industry you're in or government agency. You have content or data that's generated through different operations. It could be in HR, it could be financial reports for your organization. There's audit reports that need to be saved. And again, these are all created as transactions. And I'm going to differentiate why transactions are unique in a second. But this is just to give you an idea of where transactions originate from. You have invoices that go out. You have credit card activity, not you maybe particular, but this is what's going on in the industry in general. And these transactions potentially are real records in your organization. Okay, banking activities, deposits, withdrawals, users details, stock and futures trading, very appropriate right now. Okay, supply chain. So what Amazon does, and why Amazon right now is being very, 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 very successful, is that they have a tremendous supply chain where, and you've heard this term over and over, as it relates to things like getting masks, getting medical equipment, things that are very relevant today, where there's a process that's in place from the beginning of an order to the end of the order to the delivery. Amazon, you see their trucks driving around and everything. That's part of the supply chain, getting you stuff. And the reason that their stock is basically going up, and Jeff Bezos is making more billions of dollars, is because you're sequestered in your houses.
Right.
Okay. And you want somebody to deliver it to you. I mean, you'd like to go out and everything, but they're telling you to stay at home pretty much. But now if you can order, and that's what we're seeing, and that's why Amazon's doing so well, it's not because people are lazy. You know, we go to the store, they're not allowed to go to the store. So Amazon, and part of their supply chain and the detail of each transaction within that chain of delivery is recorded. You know, it's like if you order something, let's say in the mail, and you get a notification from UPS, and you click on the thing, it's all transactions in the behind the scenes. You're not getting an image, you're getting a link to a transaction, and they show you almost in real time what's going on. But each one of those transactions and those lines in that history of delivery is a transaction that's pertinent to the record. Internet of Things, manufacturing, how robots tie into operations, and now building cars, and robots are just, you know, kind of expanding significantly as artificial intelligence gets better. But all the activity is captured. It's not captured as your traditional, you know, Word document, PDF, or whatever. It's captured as a data element, a data transaction that, in effect, if you're manufacturing drugs, you're manufacturing rockets or anything like that, that data needs to be saved as a record. And then disposition transactions, what you have disposed of in terms of even records at the end, they basically are recorded as transactions. Okay, so if we look at transactional data uniqueness, what you typically see is in the picture on the right hand side, there's two things there. One is, in effect, a Word document. In front of that are transactions against that Word document. Okay, and on the side are some of the additional properties against that transaction that maybe you're not storing in the database. Okay, where you're storing the indexing values, the metadata, and everything else. So this, in essence, takes the data, takes the image, the Word document in this particular case, and that creates the transaction for records management. Okay. Now, transactional data as a record is different. Okay, it may or may not be stagnant. So a transaction, a financial transaction, may change because you updated the price, you updated a credit, okay, and that goes against the transactional record. So transactional records potentially are always changing. Sometimes they're stagnant, sometimes they're not. But that's what makes it very complex in terms of where do you capture that as a record. So when does a transaction become a record? Is it when the transaction is completed? Is it in the middle of the transaction? Is it the start of the transaction? You know, it's a determination that's part of the policy if you are saving transactions as records. You know, one of the questions I asked Scott to pose is...
Yeah. So I wanted to put a poll up, but I'm having a bit of an issue getting that situated. So in the chat, if you guys could answer for us, how many of you all are managing transactional records? That'd be a huge insight.
Yeah, we'd appreciate that, because I don't think most people are doing it. And again, because of the complexity. But, you know, it's again, goes to the, you know, record governance in the organization, that you got to understand, where is the exposure for saving this data? So
exposure.
Well, in legal exposure.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Again, if you have to go for litigation because something wasn't created properly and you have the transaction history to show it was or it wasn't,
Okay.
you
This
know,
may
that's,
be a kindergarten question, but what's the difference? Is there a difference between transactional records and audits?
well, audits are basically, I mean, there's two types of audits. There's, let's say, a financial audit where they come
Mm-hmm.
in and you have these consultants come in and say, yeah, your financials are good. All
Mm-hmm.
right. Then you have audits against systems. Okay.
Mm.
I think I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but you have audits about security. You have audits in a records management system that says who touched what when, who looked at it.
Okay.
Okay, what did you do with it? How did you dispose of it? Those are the audits that, in effect, are transactions, or basically, if you look at a spreadsheet, the rows in the spreadsheet, that's a transaction. But what is a complete transaction is something we'll talk a little bit more about.
Okay.
Okay, versioning. Again, this is where data changes. What version do you keep? Do you keep the first? You keep the last? How do you supersede that if you're collecting transactional data? You save the data file. So here's an example that you can take what is in your database, again, these rows and the columns in effect, and you can put them export them into a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, and then you can save this Excel spreadsheet as a record. So that's one way of doing it. All right. But then again, it's back to the timing element. When do I initiate that capture or that snapshot? And so the full transactional record, unfortunately or fortunately, can be in multiple databases or tables. So you see here where I have my transactional data mortgage. I have trade and investment transactions. I have my master data about the person. I have deposits. I have withdrawals. I have all that. And all of those may be in separate databases or different tables within a large database. So the challenge here is if you look at your statement sometime, I know when I look at my statement when it says zero money I have, it also could say what my mortgage is, if it's the same bank. It can also say my credit card information. And that what happens is you're really assembling all this data from different sources, these transactions, and you're presenting it in what we call a materialized view. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So this is what makes it very challenging to know if I'm pulling all this data in, what am I really saving at the end as the record? And we'll get into that. But this goes toward also this idea of separation of data. And you've heard it and we've talked about it, I think last semester or semester before, about the notion of blockchain. I won't go into it, but blockchain is a big part of supply chain management. It's really protecting data in a certain way by separating it out. Not one data element has all the information in it. So here's a materialized view as I was talking about. So here's my account summary, dividend and capital gain summary, my retirement contributions, and so on. Well, all this data potentially lives in different data tables. And that then, when you materialize the view, it creates what you would consider as a records management, a typical record. I could save that, okay?
Right.
I could save it because the output was a PDF or some other format. It could be a TIFF. All right. This is what the customer sees. This is what, account reps see, but the data is not stored this way. It's stored
Right.
in rows and
Right.
tables. But guess what? Parts of a record.
In answer to our question, we have
Yeah.
a variety of no, we don't. Not managing transactional records. Some folks are. Some folks are somewhat sort of doing it. We manage invoice payments and receipts.
Yeah.
So I would imagine it's so broad that
That's why it's very difficult to look at an organization, a big organization. We're talking this semester on the big end, okay, enterprise wide and so on, to assess and create the inventory, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, of what's really out there, and also from the governance policy, what do we need to save?
mm-hmm.
All right, and I don't think it's a topic that's been addressed to any great extent from people I've talked to in the records management arena. I mean, records managers are still trying to get the base stuff, the emails, the Word documents, electronic files, maybe the social media now, the multimedia. That's really the main focus right now. But eventually, things like transactions will be considered more heavily as records. But they do, again, potentially play a role in litigation, and you need to know where this stuff is. PDF conversion, as I mentioned before, it's unique because you have to take the data and, again, materialize it into a savable format. And then templates and overlays. You see where it says fidelity? Okay. What happens is, and some of you may get, like from your credit card companies and everything else, advertisements in what you see, okay, in your statements, all right? The advertisements are dynamic. They are applied maybe depending. It's almost like when you go on the internet and you look up, you want to buy something, and then 2 days later you keep seeing ads for something similar popping up. Well, in effect, they're in effect templated stuff that and overlays that come based on what you're doing. Right. So if you're buying things on your statement and say, I'm buying these shoes or this car or whatever, they could actually put advertisements in there dynamically on the run. All right. Yep. So it's kind of a way to take additional information, images now, and populate a record along with the transactional data. Okay, transactional records, 5 processing stages, similar, that we've talked about in the other classes in terms of the different stages. So here's a perfect example of supply chain management. And so you enter your customer details, book, pick, ship, invoice, receipt. All this is a transaction against a singular event. All right. And they, again, can be stored in different areas. So this is, again, the challenge. So you look at the inventory that's out there. We look at how we capture this information, how we store it, the processing of it, and the disposition of it. Okay. At the end, when Scott comes along with his broom and pan, and he sweeps all this stuff in and gets rid of it for you. Okay, inventory. Again, this stuff in an enterprise is all over the place. And trying to understand where this data is coming from. It's not what's in file cabinets. It's not what's in SharePoint. That's not where this inventory exists. The inventory exists outside of that in your HR application, in your accounts payable application. It goes on and on and on.
We did have some folks that answered that they manage the application, but not the record.
The application, I'm assuming, like an HR application, that's what it's managed, and the data lives in there as transactions, okay? But how do you manage that as a record? How do you have control over these external systems that are owned by other custodial groups and not you? You're not the owner. When you move stuff typically in a records management environment into a system, you are the custodian of that. Okay. You are responsible when it's in that records management system. When it's external, it's a little bit hard to do, obviously. So, what you have to decide as a records manager, and the company has to decide, is who has custodial rights or control over this kind of information. Again, adds to the complexity of this whole discussion. So the inventory, obviously, is, as we've talked about before, we have to identify the departments that create transactions. Okay, my policy department, my HR department, my financial department, and what do these transactions look like? What is currently being saved? How are they saving it? For how long are they saving it? How are they purging it? Because if you want to consider this as a record, which I think you need to at some point, you need to identify the departments that are creating this stuff. And you have to have a dialogue with them to be able to figure out, is it stuff we need to keep or not? Almost always externally generated, stored. That's what I'm saying. In these different legacy applications, HR, financial, so on, supply chain. Consider current output formats. How do you get the data out of there? If you want to move it as a record into the records management system, how am I going to get it? Do I get it as, I don't know, a report, a printed report? Yeah, you can get it that way. Do they create PDFs for me? Get them electronically? I can do that. Do I get them just as individual transaction records? Okay, in an ISV file, or an ASCII file, and absorb them that way. Determine organizational records governance policies. That's one of the things that I think if you talk to your governance group, if you have one, which I assume most of you do in the large organizations, you should pose the question, what are we doing about transactional data? And I'm going to say, just stay busy with the with the stuff you're doing right now. Don't raise this question, because they don't know themselves. Is there a record schedule for managing transactional data? Yeah, there are and there aren't. They are different. Needs to be looked at. Is there PII in the transaction? Personally identifiable information, which we've talked about in this semester, last semester. And what do you do when the transactions do have this in there? They could have social security number in there. They have the name. They have the address. They may have their license number, or driver's license. All those kinds of things exist in these legacy transactional systems. And now you're saying, okay, well, I'm going to take some of this, and either I'm going to materialize it, or I'm going to send those transactions to my records management system. Well, are you even allowed to put PII in your records management system? We talk to a lot of organizations and customers, and they're not even allowed to transfer anything into the records management system that has PII in it. So it's a big consideration. Determine the permissible data to be transferred. So it kind of links back to 6. And what is the data that I'm allowed to put in my records management system? And how have we determined that? And what exposure do you have with all the new rules, GDPR? You have in California, more states are adopting the California model, that the information has to be deleted if it's not relevant, or when let's say the customer says, how much data do you have on me? What is the data? No, you're not allowed to have that data, and you have to expunge that data. So again, it gets into legal issues as well, and you got to consider that in terms of how you manage this transactional data. Okay, so the next step, I'm going to take a quick drink, is, what is it, Scott? Tell them what it is. It's capture.
Capture?
Capture.
Capture. While you're taking a drink, there's different spectrums in which people are managing their transactional records. What would you recommend in doing that? And I see that there's some folks here that have a centralized system where there's highly trained people in it, and there's a lot of transparency going on there.
Right. And it's resource-wise, it takes a little bit more management than some of the other stuff. Like if compared it to email just, if you have Exchange servers or Google servers for mail, that can be journaled in. It's pretty straightforward. Okay? Yeah. But you're saving, in effect, transactions. You're saving metadata and everything else. But so what specifically? What was the question?
It was a comment.
A comment.
Yeah, that they have a system that's well documented. They have trained folks working the system.
If it's well documented, what I would suggest, send it. I would love to see what you have on that.
Awesome.
Okay, because like I said, I'm not finding many people who do or have even considered it. So if you're willing to share it, you can neuter it, whatever you want to do. I'll sign a non-disclosure to take a look at it. But I'd be very interested, because there's not much stuff in the published about how to really do this. Okay. So now we're at the capture stage. So all this stuff we've been talking about that's sticking out there in different servers and legacy applications, how we're going to get this stuff in. Oh, how the heck did that happen? Did we hit something going back? Oh, I must be. There we go. I must have been on the back arrow. Okay. Data and data indexes is about the data. Well, this is kind of interesting, because is the data, or do you have indexes against the data to define the data?
Say that again 5 times fast.
I can't. That's the last time I'm ever saying this. So really what you're really trying to save is the data, but you may have additional indexes against the data, which could be what's its category,
Hmm.
right? So there may be an appendage to your data, another column that says what this data is about, because if you're doing retention disposition against a transaction, then you have to have something in there that defines that specific type of data. Overlay association. Um, Basically on this, there is when I capture the data, like I was explaining on the statements, the bank statements, credit card statements, when I said Fidelity is up and on the top of it is a graphic. The overlay is when that data is brought in to create this materialized view, you also have to have the related data or the related overlay so I can associate the two. So I'm capturing, in this particular case I capture data and the particular overlay. Systems of origin and data storage structure, kind of talked a little bit about that in terms of the inventory. You need to know where the stuff is and what is the structure of that data. Is that all the data in one database table, or is it spread out amongst a lot of tables, which makes your job, not your job, it's IT's job to actually get the stuff out of there, and you just have to work with them to define what you need in terms of your governance policies. When is the record complete? Again, when does the record become the record? So the transactions are sitting out there. When do I really want to capture them? Do they get flagged when the full, let's say, life cycle is completed, or the supply chain cycle is completed? Do I want to capture them at stages? Again, things to consider. You know, this whole course and all the courses that I teach are really about things for you to consider. And
Right.
there's no exact definition of all these things.
Hmm.
There's definitions of what certain categories are and so on and so forth. But these are really process related and data element related that you need to consider when you're standing in front of your governance group or whomever and say, you know what, this ain't so easy. This is very complex stuff if we want to
Right.
do it right. You got to give me some resources. You got to give me money. You got to give me more vacation, whatever you need to get through this.
Getting tons of vacation right now.
Yeah, well, that's true. Um, push or pull data migration. Again, there's an ability to, they can extract the information out of the database, let's say, the transactions, and they write it to a directory, and that can be swept in, or your record system can actually through what they call APIs or web services. Basically, it's a programming to pull the stuff out of your legacy applications. But when you pull it, you got to have it locked, because that indicates that that transaction can be a record. Okay. When you push it, you know it is, because you're pushing it all the time. You have more control. Will transactional data have a different record schedule? Again, you need to look at what your record schedule is right now and see if there's any elements in there with regard to transactional information. I'm thinking not in most cases. It sounds like there's a couple of people out there doing it, but it is potentially a different type of record schedule, because
Okay.
it's a different type of file, if you want to consider it that way. What guarantees is fidelity? Changing paper versus a data field. You know, most records, when you bring them in, as we've talked about before, there's a file, it's a PDF, it's a TIFF image, all those kinds of things that are converted into electronic format. Basically, you can guarantee the fidelity based on the byte count of that
Okay.
record. Okay, and if the byte count changes, you know that. All right. But when you change data in a data field, there's no real byte count that's watching the whole transaction. So that becomes a little bit more challenging, and the ability to change a record that's a data field is obviously a lot easier. Should we leave it in the database and just ignore it? Yeah, it's a lot easier to do it that way. And then you say, oh, well, my database in this particular legacy application is backed up, and that's my records management. I mean, it's legitimate. The only point I'm trying to make here is that, and in effect, ignore it, that it's something that needs to be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
about transactional data. Do I just leave it there? Are we happy with it? Is it our policy? Does it work? And that may be all okay while you're
Right.
busy doing your other stuff. But again, it's a point of consideration. Can you ignore pure data that could be critical to litigation? I suggest the manufacturing process again. Uh, Look at the data. Is a transaction potentially a discoverable item that needs to be maintained?
I don't know if you've done the numbers on this yet, but what percentage in the information portfolio does transactional data take up? What percentage would you say?
In terms of storage size, I'm going to get to this in a few minutes, but it's because most things are generated, at least still today,
Mm-hmm.
based on transactions. Okay, I'm doing a financial thing. Okay, it's
Mm-hmm.
a transaction, right? Manufacturing drugs, it's a transaction. So most of the data that's really created is transactional data.
Mm-hmm.
The other things take up a lot more space because they're a PDF, or they are a Word document, or something like that, or 100-page scanned image. All right, that's big storage.
Yeah.
All right, but in terms of defining that, it's very small because it's
Mm-hmm.
a simple transaction. Defines what it is, who created it, and everything else. But transaction, think of the stock market right now.
Mm-hmm.
How many transactions are going on? Billions of transactions a day, and that's all has to be captured.
Yeah.
Because when I create the statement to send to my investor, I have to have that pretty darn accurate.
Right.
All right. So a lot of data, it's just tremendous. Okay, storage. What is a transaction record? That's what we're going to talk about. Are you simply replicating the data? Am I taking the data out of one source and just putting it into my records management system, or is there other additional information about that I want to save? So am I replicating the data? Like I said, if you want to keep it all in the database and you do a backup of your database, or you do a disaster recovery where a copy of it somewhere else, so in case one system goes down, the other system can be spun up very, very quickly. That's one way of considering it. And again, legitimate, right? But again, consider what do you want to do about replicating the data? Structured data in a full text database. All that data is very, very the data that is generated as transactions. What we've done, okay, and what we've seen customers wanting to do is that along with the transactional data, all right, the defined indexing values, you also take that, you take the Word document, you strip all the words out of it, you put both of those into your full text database for better e-discovery capabilities. So you're really grabbing both of those. Defining the data about the data, as we mentioned before. Storing an instance of the database as a complete record as a backup. Some people do this. They say, this is my record. The only problem is you gotta you can't really get into the content and the transactions. You actually have to repurpose it back to something that can read that information. And that's typically the application that was originally created. But it is legitimate to just take a snapshot of the whole database and store that and say, yeah, we're storing it. If I ever have to get it back, I'll worry about it then.
Right.
As pure data, okay, if we look at transactions, this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, we'd get to transactions. If you, let's say you have a PDF of 100 pages, all right, and you have the transaction that is associated with that PDF, all right, or materialized statement, whatever. The data is about 50 to 100 times smaller than the object. And that's why, as we'll go a little bit further here, we talk about keeping the data as data, and then generating a materialized view on the fly. So real-time materialized view. If you go to your bank online and you look up your statement. Now, statements can be created in real time as a materialized view. They just grab the data and plop, 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 plop. It looks like an image, right? Or they can post process it. They've already created it, and now it's stored as an image. Guess which one takes up more space, Scott? Uh-oh, here we go.
Pressure. The 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 prior the post
The post processing. Yeah, because you've already created this, all right? And once you create it, it's stagnant, right? Because it's a record.
Yeah.
Your real-time materialized view, if there's an update to it, like a credit, okay, one of your vendors didn't deliver their product and they give you credit for it, what you'll see is the real time on the site.
Yeah.
All right. So there's some advantages to having it that way. There's something called cold. It's an old term, been around since I've been around. And what they do is they take the data and compress it significantly. So if you think of statements, let's say 10,000 statements for 10,000 different people, the statements are basically look the same. All right, pretty standard. And what they can do is they can compress 10,000 of these statements together, get rid of all the spaces and everything. So they reduce the size of it. So it's another consideration. We have a customer that has, I don't know, 1.5 million statements a month. So, they wanted to save space. And so that data just gets compressed. And then when the user wants to see their statement, it decompresses it, pulls out the right data, and puts it onto this template.
Wow.
All right. Kind of neat. But the problem is, you have to start looking at what are my data storage costs versus consumer retrieval time and reconstituting the view.
Mm-hmm.
If your user's sitting out there twiddling their thumbs for 5 minutes before they get a real view of the stuff, what is the benefit of having something almost instantaneously presented as a materialized image versus waiting for this to come up? All right. Yeah. And some people, with the way Google works, where in 1/10 of a second you can have 2 million things appear, people don't want to wait anymore. Right. So again, as a business, you need to consider that. Transactional records processing. So creating the record set, data set. Okay, what is the record? Where am I getting all this data from? Generating the materialized view is part of this whole process that takes place. Again, do you do it on the fly? Do you do it ahead of time? Full text to find detail. So here's another idea that let's say you take credit card statements. The idea here is that if I go in to look up Scotty's last statement for his credit card, right? I have certain information I can use to look him up. Name, couple other items, account number, dates, and so on. It's a limited set of information that I can look at. But now I'm looking at that Scott went out and bought a baseball glove for his kid, and the baseball glove was stolen, and he wants to send in the insurance and all that other stuff. So now you want to take the data from that statement. It has maybe the store, the item, etc. I want to search on that as well as Scott as an individual. So this transactional information can also be put into the full text database for searching reasons and discovery, which is the next subject. So e-discovery, when you have the combination of the full text transactional information as well as the content of the different individual little transactions, your e-discovery is a lot more complete than it would be, because I can isolate it down for, let me see all the invoices that only talked about this rocket part. All right. And it could be this manufacturer and everything else, but I don't want to go and look, if I go into the system and I look up the vendor, I may get 10,000 things back that I don't care about. But if I look and I'm looking for this rocket part, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're the only ones that come up, it saves a lot of time for e-discovery. File presentation. So if you are saving transactions, consideration here is, how do you want to present it? All right. Do you want to export it as a spreadsheet? Do you want to present it as, or you save it as a spreadsheet, export it as a spreadsheet? Do you want to save it as a materialized view? What do you want to do when you actually have to present this to somebody for review? Records management and process transactional data becoming records. Your whole records management process are a bunch of transactions, the steps that you take, the things that you do. All right. And so these audits, as we talked about earlier, basically at the end of the process, at the end of the life cycle of your records, you might want to have a record of the life cycle of the records. So that is really created and stored as transactional data. It's no different than when we were looking at the statements, because they're just rows in a database that are maybe updated or whatever. But the end result of that is some materialized report that organizations want to save as records. Audit and security logs as transactions that materialize, kind of just already touched on that. And public access. So the customer I was talking about that had 1.5 million statements a month, the question they needed to consider is, do we give them access to the records management system to look at more of the historical statements? The current statements usually will just be generated and viewed within your, let's say, your banking application, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. But as they age out, how much do you want to keep in that banking application? And if it's considered a record, you want to get them into something that's more secure, nobody's changing it, and so on. So how do you open that up to the outside world if you want to look at the older ones? And I go in, I look back, a year or two, and it also depends on what the system of creation and how long you want to keep the data in there. All right. Just another consideration. Okay, transaction disposition, kind of similar to the things we've talked about before. And if you sat through the 5 classes or you looked at the videos, a lot of this stuff is consistent across different types of records. There's some significant differences like the ones we are talking about today, but there's something gets stored, captured. There's something that gets labeled. There's something that goes through a process. There's something that then is disposed of at the end. Okay, it's not magic. It's just what the magic is for individual types of content. Materialized record file format, similar to the other files as I mentioned. Review of a database snapshot, basically impossible. That's what I was saying earlier. If you take a whole snapshot of a database and you want to figure out at disposition time, do you get rid of the whole database, or you have to go in there and look at transactions? Makes it a little more difficult. Package and format for transfer. How do I transfer this stuff if I need to transfer it to somebody? The transactions that I have here that I've been saving as records, and depending on how you've been saving it, how do I transfer it? How do I package it up? Do I need a viewer to look at the data? Do I need an Excel viewer to look at the spreadsheet that has all the transaction data as rows and columns? Points of consideration. Okay. Transfer, accession, authoritative organization, archive it. It's same as we've talked about on other types of file types. It's just what do I do? When do I do it? How much of it do I have to do? And when do I recognize I've completed the task and deleted it out of the system? And then you have the disposition of transaction metadata, the object itself, and the full text. Remember, if you put the stuff in the full text, you can reconstitute an image even though you've deleted the object. So you got to be careful about that the full text, along as the object is gone, that's really the best option. Some people do keep the metadata for a period of time to prove that they had it, but they don't have to deliver the backup detail of that transaction. Recordization of disposition reports. So I go through my own disposition and I want to recordize it. I want to materialize the data that talks about my disposition and how it was disposed of, and when it was disposed of, and now I make a record of that. It all depends on how fanatical you are about keeping records, and it changes. Every industry, and even within industries and everything, they all have their own peculiar ways of dealing with records. Now, if you're in federal government, NARA dictates a lot of that, but you're still going to manage it differently because everybody has different types of records management systems. Some leave the records in place, some don't, and so on and so forth. It's really how you do your work and making sure you keep some kind of history or trail of what you did. And then we've talked about this before: vendor migration, export utility, effort, ownership, cost. So when After 10 years, and you decide, okay, I need a different records management system. What are you going to do about the transactions now that have to be moved into those systems? And what tools does the vendor give you to actually do that export? All right. So in summary, for the whole semester, all right, we talked about data sources and volume continue to grow. We know that. Once you conquer email, you got something else to conquer. And then you got another one to conquer, and another one to conquer. You got 5 of them that you really have to conquer in general. Then we've covered those this semester. Different strategy required for various file types. We talked about multimedia, and that also plays into your external stuff, whether I'm managing it in place, where you're controlling it based on retention disposition schedules, but you're actually leaving the content in the remote system. So there's different strategies for how you will process these file types. Early source of record creation inventory assessment. We've talked about this in every one of the classes. Figure out your inventory. Try to learn where your content lives. And the good news, if you're a records manager and people say, don't worry about it. Your job, once we give you the content, is just store it, manage it, dispose of it. You smile as much as you can and say, great. But when you start to get involved more of the capture side of this and defining that and how that's going to be done and how that's going to be cleaned up before it's even sent into you, now your job gets interesting. Now you're earning your keep.
That smile turns into a smirk.
Because a lot of people don't understand how important this is.
Yeah.
Creating connectivity to the inventory is on a case-by-case basis. Again, you have this inventory, 50 different applications out there, whether it's transactional. Again, this is covering the semester summary, whether it's transactional data, whether it's email, whether it's Word documents, whatever, okay? It's a case-by-case basis in terms of how you connect to these systems and how information is going to be sent in. The beauty of physical records is you got a warehouse. Yeah. And that's what you worry about. Those are the records in the warehouse. And then if you have to scan them and digitize them, great. I still have that record. I have it. I'm controlling it. But, you don't have to connect to a lot of things here. But when you're connecting with 50 different systems, yes. Assessing what content, if any, will be managed in place. We've talked about this. We talked about managing in place a lot with multimedia because multimedia tends to have large file sizes, and sometimes you don't want to bog down your records management system, so you leave it in place and you connect to it through different types of links. Disposition of content types do not follow the same rules, obviously. That's why you have categories. And so your disposition schedules for different things will impact your system in various ways. And one way is the storage area, because the longer you keep stuff, the more storage that you need, the harder it is to do e-discovery. So the content the rules is you get rid of it. We suggest you get rid of it. Your legal team may say you don't get rid of it. Good luck on that one. Consideration for life cycle load balancing from capture through disposition. This is just, if you look at the life cycle of any kind of content you have in your organization, when it's coming in, when you got to get rid of it, where it's coming from, you have all this activity going on within your records management system. And going back to that comment I made about the 1.5 million statements and opening up to the older ones to the public and so on, with security, obviously. Those people, you may have 10 records managers in your organization, but if you have 1.5 million people out there banging away at this thing, what does that do to your system in terms of volume, in terms of access time, et cetera, et cetera? So load balancing in terms of what the system is doing for whom is very important to look at when you're either evaluating your records management system, upgrading it, or trying to do something beyond what you've been doing with it. And it's a big point of consideration. Okay, so that's the meat and the potatoes of this last class. As we've mentioned, we go to the RMU community site. It's a great place for information. If you want to, comment on today's event, that would be great.
So,
What's the matter?
someone put a link to Mitch Farbstein, Bucknell University, in the chat.
Did they really?
They sure did.
All right, now you can.
Thank you, Mike.
I can also post the article. But anyway, yeah, appreciate that. I guess you were bored listening to me, so you went and did some searching. See, we get a report after each class as the attentiveness of the audience, because I guess the system that we use, the web system that we use, has the ability to know if you're keyboarding other things while you're supposed to be listening. So I don't. Oh my!
I'm glad he did the research for me, because I was gonna definitely
You were going to do
Google
that.
it.
All right, we have to put the link in the community. Okay, so who's afraid of the big bad record data? Not Fife. Okay, and these are the things that we talked about this semester. I think we covered the high level topics on each of them. And to give you an idea, and I hope we've shared with you additional things you might not have thought about, and how volume really does affect it, and how volume in the future is going to get more and more and more. So kind of be prepared for that. Okay, so upcoming events. Well, based on what everything else is going right now, so this one's been canceled that we were supposed to be at. All right, so on March 26th. The other ones, I have no clue right now. I think we're too far away from the ARMA national event that's in Detroit in October. So I'm assuming that that will potentially still go on. The e-discovery one has been moved to September down in the DC area. So hopefully we'll see at some of these. And, I also offer, if, especially with what's going on right now, if you have an ARMA chapter that's interested in a particular presentation, I'm willing to consider that. I've talked to some folks already. It's not on site. Typically it's, a remote broadcast.
Yeah.
So I will entertain, and I don't charge for it.
Awesome. Awesome. And on the topic of the community site, there are some folks asking about if anyone has a social media policy. That would be a great place to post it, be a resource
Absolutely.
to your records management buddies. And how about those folks out there?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it is. Or you put the contact information for your, or we'll figure something out. But that's what we want to use the community site for you to share your experiences. Collectively, you have a heck of a lot more experience than I do in doing this. I mean, my what I bring to the table is different types of researches, different types of trying to understand the complexity of this and how to better approach it. Okay, how you actually do these implementations, other than the ones I've done directly. You have more experience with that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I admit it. Okay, so we have any burning questions?
Burning questions.
Any questions? Any cold questions? Any icebox questions?
I have a question actually for the attendees that are still on before you guys log off.
Go.
Would you guys consume this in podcast form? That's one thing that's really bubbling up out there.
We've talked about trying to do those kinds of things too. Yeah. Any feedback you can give us, or any other vehicle you think would be advantageous for us to consider, we'll consider anything.
Okay, I'm seeing different answers. We do have a question. What does a transactional data retention schedule look like? Yes, I would be interested in a podcast. So,
yeah. Again, it depends on how you want to manage the data. Again, you can manage them as individual transactions, which I don't really recommend. Okay, leave that in your legacy applications. But what I do recommend is taking snapshots of that data, like a statement, and storing that as the record long term. Okay, because your transactional systems that are publishing this information dynamically tend to charge for how many transactions are done, especially if you're in the cloud doing it now, versus you have an on-premises system, which you have more control over. So you have to consider the cost, and the cost of how how much is being charged based on the amount of data you're storing in your legacy application. If you get them off its records, then I would suggest that's really the best way to do it. But again, you got to determine how long you need to keep those records.
Mm.
Financial records, typically, if I go to my bank, it says they have it for 7 years going back.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So we'll put out the fires as they come up. And so here we go. We're at the end of the semester. And, you know, to all our global RMU participants, stay well. And we hope to engage in the future. Stay safe. You know, I've been flying a lot, and even in my office, I wear masks. So people don't have to look at my face more than anything. But, you know, it's something that's obviously changing the world right now. We're all affected by it. And, you know, we work together to get beyond this craziness. But we shall see. The future is the future.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Anything, Scott, you want to say?
Take action on your transactions.
Very good. Did
I
you
thought of that.
think you had to go through a whole class of... All right, Scott and I have great fun together, and we hope you've enjoyed this semester, and we'll engage in the future.
Signing off.